Happy Thursday morning to everybody from here in central Alabama, where we had some unseasonably cold weather last night. Hopefully that's the end of it for 2021, for a while at least. But we're here. We made it through the night. The sun's back out again, as you can see on my side of my room here where I'm streaming to you from. And I'm joined by Ben Flanagan for another episode of Bammers. And this is our weekly show where we dig into Alabama fan culture. We look at Alabama football from the fans' perspective, and most importantly, we get the fans' perspective directly from you guys in this show. A huge part of what we do on here is reacting to comments from our viewers while we discuss whatever topic it is that we're talking about, which we'll get to in a second. But we really want you guys to be an active part of the show, and you've done a great job of that every week. And if you're watching on YouTube, if you're watching on Facebook, comment, give us your thoughts about what we're talking about, and we will include your comments in the show. Sometimes we'll even talk about them and go off on a tangent and get into a debate with you guys about it. So please don't be shy. Jump into the comments as soon as we start getting into it. But Ben, we're talking today about an off the field part of following Alabama football and being fans of Alabama players. And it's a side of things that I think you and I have gotten to experience both parts of, because when you're growing up watching football, they're all guys in the same uniform. You don't really see their face. You don't get to know all that much about them. And when you become a media member, you get to actually meet these guys and talk to them. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough to cover Alabama, you get them in these big college football playoff media days that you and I have both been fortunate enough to participate in, where you kind of get them to yourself. You get to just go over and talk to any player on the team you want, kind of for as long as you want. And you really do get to know these guys a little bit better. And so what we're talking about today is the guys that we've met who we think are the most interesting Alabama football players, at least of the Saban era.
Yeah, and if we want to jump right in, we can talk about the catalyst for why we wanted to do this list in the first place.
Yeah, let's do that.
I mean, but you're right. I mean, we're in a unique position where we're able to sort of get to know the players on a different level, I think, and that's true for more people than me. Like, I'm not a beat writer, and you know, I'm not. I've photographed one season. I've been around the Alabama program a little bit here and there, but enough to really get a sharper sense of who a lot of these players are. I'm obsessed with watching our coverage, AL.com's coverage, and other folks' coverage, especially when it comes to interviewing the players, whether that's during a week of practice, whether it's after a game, or during the off season. The players are obviously more than just athletes, and it's always interesting to see their personalities shine through in interviews like that. And they often have really thoughtful things to say, which I think is reflected in this list.
Yeah. So let's before we dig into it, we did just want to mention. I'll start us off, Ben, by mentioning my number 5 player that I picked out for this list, because I want to talk about why we've gotten to know him and why we've learned so much more about him really just in the past few weeks and months. And that is Najee Harris. And you know, in our case, I think we all knew Najee was a really interesting guy. I think we had a sense that there was something different about him, just because of the way that he plays, his style of football. We didn't hear from him a ton as a player. He didn't make it to the podium a lot. And sometimes that happens to guys who are particularly unique and don't don't put a filter on what they want to say. We don't hear from guys like that quite as often. And we have had the opportunity at AL.com to do a documentary with Najee. We proposed it to him. We said, hey, do you want to be the focus of our series for Road to the Pros this year? And Najee very graciously, not only did he agree to do that, but he gave us one of the most generous, I think, and fascinating interviews that we've ever had the opportunity to do. He sat down with us for multiple hours and just kind of poured his heart out. And we learned a lot about where Najee comes from, his backstory, and how he feels about his college career, how he feels about Alabama, which is complicated. I think he as he told us, he has no doubt that he made the right decision coming to Alabama, but there's parts of it that have been difficult for him. And so if you have not seen the first 2 episodes of Road to the Pros about Najee Harris, they're on wherever you're watching this. They're on our Facebook page. They're on our YouTube channel. Highly suggest you go and seek those out. He is a fascinating dude.
Yeah, and my list is in no particular order. And he's
I would
there.
say the same thing. He's just the first one I wanted to talk about.
No, and that's true for me too. Najee Harris is right here. And if you haven't watched the Road to the Pros doc yet, you'll get a pretty good idea of who he is and sort of what sets him and his personality apart. Our colleague Wes Seiner, who's the director of that series, he did an excellent job of getting to the heart of Najee the person. And in some cases, all you really need to do to accomplish that is just hand him a microphone, turn on the camera, and let him talk. He's a quirky guy who certainly marches to the beat of his own drum, but I don't know that he's really that different from anyone other than that he's willing to speak his mind honestly and like you said, without much of a filter at all. And that's obviously very entertaining, but obviously also very enlightening too, especially to sports journalists who always want to get to know players and tell their stories in new ways. But whether it's, the Road to the Pros doc or his recent interview with Pat McAfee or really any interview that he does, he's rarely going to sugarcoat anything. And then, you factor things like his childhood in California, the tragedies that he encountered, how he persevered through that. That's something that a lot of student athletes certainly also experience, but it's really more of the way he expresses it. That makes Najee one of the most interesting people in sports, let alone Alabama football.
And I'll tell you, there are a couple of moments. I was fortunate enough because I'm the manager of our video team. I get to see this stuff before you guys do, and that's a big treat for me. I'm as excited about it as anybody. But I was there were a couple of things that really jumped out at me watching the interviews. One of them was obviously the story he tells on the most recent episode about how the march on campus kind of came to happen. And it was, it was the result of a lot of things going on. But this story that Najee tells about how the team basically had a meeting together about it. And then they all followed Najee upstairs to Nick Saban's office to tell Nick Saban, hey, here's what we're going to do. That is some imagery. Najee says in the interview, is like a movie. He turns around and sees all of his teammates following him up to Saban's office. So really cool scene that he set there. And then the other part that really jumped out at me was just the folks back home from where he's from in Antioch, California, talking about Najee graduating and passing his last final, and his trainer, guy who's been training him since high school, just is really, he's a huge guy. He's a big dude who does not much but lift weights all day and train elite athletes. And he couldn't keep the tears in on camera when Wes was interviewing him. So it was some pretty amazing stuff to see.
Najee is also a really confident guy too, in a way that I think you don't see a lot of other players express it. I think that he wears his frustration on his sleeve in a really funny way. Like, it's not like there's bitterness or anything like that, but he feels like, you get this sense like he felt like he had to prove something that he knew for a long time about his skill set, his ability, how he could perform on the football field. And so when he finally got that opportunity and got more carries and was on the field more than he had been during his first 2 seasons, people started to say, wow, I didn't know you could do that. And his response was always just kind of this like huff, like, I always knew I could do that. Yeah. I just needed the opportunity. So you just don't really see that very often with players. And that's what makes him so unique and just a joy to watch.
Well, fascinating dude. And again, I encourage everybody to go check out Road to the Pros on Najee Harris, which is either here on the Facebook page where you're watching it or on YouTube, wherever it is that you happen to be watching us right now. Just scroll back into our other videos and you'll see the 2 episodes we've aired so far, and then we've got 2 more coming. There will be another one on Monday that's about Najee, basically everything from the championship game until now as he gets ready for the draft. And then we'll actually be with him on draft night. So you'll the week after the draft, you will get the episode that is often the most fun for us to film and watch, which is the moment these guys actually get the call that they're headed to the NFL. So still good stuff to come in that series. Ben, do you want to pick another name for our most interesting list?
Yeah. So if I say the words Birmingham Biscuit Bowl, who comes to mind? And Matt, this should ring like very close to you specifically. So Ryan Anderson, a former outside linebacker from the sort of, I guess, 2015-16 era of the Saban dynasty. Similar to Najee Harris, Ryan Anderson, he was never afraid to sort of speak his mind. And I thought that he had a great run for a long time, maybe until Najee, as the best soundbite of the Saban era. And Matt, you were responsible for one of those amazing moments when you asked him if he would ever sit out a bowl game. That was sort of like a popular trend among some players. If they wanted to get themselves ready for the NFL draft, the bowl game became secondary in terms of their priorities. They wanted to stay healthy, especially if they were playing in a game that didn't mean anything. And he said, quote, "For what? I'm playing for a national championship. I'm not playing in the Birmingham Biscuit Bowl or the Louisiana Crawfish Bowl." And then he went on to say the Ragin' Cajun Bowl. And he just made an amazing point about that really reflected what kind of a competitor that he was or is, really, because he's still in the NFL fighting for a job and competing. But this was a guy who cared about winning, and he was playing at the highest level. And that may be obvious to some people, but perhaps not when you see guys who are sitting out. And maybe these guys won't sit out if they're in the national championship game, and it's an easier decision if you are playing in the Birmingham Biscuit Bowl. But Ryan Anderson, aside from your interview, which was amazing, and again, arguably one of the greatest sound bites, I think, of the Saban era, he was just always so funny. He was always a willing participant in the interviews. He was an intense guy. He had a very certain and distinct intensity about him. His competitiveness certainly shone through even during those interviews with the beat reporters and anybody else who was talking to him. So always entertaining, a fearsome competitor on the football field too, but just an amazing soundbite.
Yeah, Ryan Anderson was a dude that, look, I have never personally experienced, I would say, disrespect on a large scale from a player towards the media. I know that has happened for other people. I've never been on the receiving end of that before. Every guy I've ever interacted with is obviously being completely professional, but sometimes they get frustrated being asked the same questions over and over again. And sometimes they're done giving the safe answer that they've been coached to give, and they want to say what they really think. And you happen to be the one there on the receiving end of that. And I don't know how many times Ryan Anderson had been asked about sitting out for the bowl game. This was in 2017, I'm pretty sure, because I want to say it was in New Orleans as they were getting ready to play Clemson in the Sugar Bowl. But I got that sense from him a little bit of, I've already been asked about this a bunch of times today, and I'm done giving the nice answer about it. And I'm going to say, this is absurd that I'm even being asked. And it was, I think it was a little absurd for it to be as big of a topic of conversation as it was. I think we now have seen that the big panic over guys sitting out bowl games is not really a thing that's ever going to affect playoff teams. It's a thing for guys who aren't enjoying playing on the team that they're on at that point. So, but yeah, I mean, outside of that quote too, Ryan Anderson was a very intimidating presence. And I know you could probably say that about any football player, because they're all, for the most part, they're almost always going to be bigger than me, a lot bigger than me. And I watched them steamroll people on a field for my job. But Ryan Anderson was a different level than the rest of these guys. And he had this sort of, I don't want to say mean streak, because he was a very funny guy too at Alabama. He was a guy who clearly had a sense of humor and was enjoying himself a lot of the time. But definitely there was a edge to him, and you got a sense that he brought that out onto the field with him. But he also had a little bit of it off the field too, and it kind of motivated everything he did.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I think the mean streak thing is something that players would take pride in, right? Because again, it reflects their competitive intensity, and that's
it's not in everybody. You know, I would say
no.
And I will talk about some guys later on this list. There's some guys that I would say are downright goofballs and are still great football players, but some guys mean it when they hit a quarterback, and Ryan Anderson means it.
And they got the look too, right? Like you hear it in pro wrestling all the time. Do they have a good look? And Ryan Anderson, he had that look where it's just like he means business. You know, Ashawn Robinson is another guy who, you know, from his interviews and by all accounts, just a really great guy, thoughtful guy, really cares about what he did and did a lot of great things. But I mean, once you see him on the football field in those pads, and especially with that helmet off, it's like, whoa, this dude means business, you know? Ryan Anderson was that kind of guy too. But, you know, I saw a lot of really cool stuff with him, whether it was in those interviews or I think right after they had lost to Clemson in 2016, they come home from Tampa. I believe that's where that game was played. Mm-hmm. And there were some fans there to meet the players to say, welcome back. We love you anyway, that kind of thing. Congratulations on a great season. And Ryan Anderson was one of the players who got off the bus and came straight to the fans and took photos with them, smiled, even though he had just had a tough loss in the national championship game that he cared about so much. So seemed to be a good guy all around and was just one of the most entertaining players of the Saban era.
For sure. Javar Santana throwing in Mika Fitzpatrick. Wants some shine for Minka here too. I will say, you know, a super interesting dude in that he played so many spots on the field and was one of the most versatile players of the Saban era, but a quiet guy, definitely a more quiet personality. And so some of us in the, you know, in the media side of things, I will say he was well known for being a super professional, polite guy. But, you know, didn't really necessarily show out as much of that sort of like big personality as a Ryan Anderson. But that's one of the interesting things about Alabama too. These guys are not cookie cutters by any means. There are some vastly different, every end of the scale personality type on this team, and they can all be contributors to, you know, elite championship winning teams. They definitely don't all sort of have the same personality type. It's often a very volatile mix.
Yeah, Mika Fitzpatrick, what an incredible player, is obviously enjoying a lot of success in the NFL right now. Yeah. But yeah, very nice guy. I remember whenever he encountered the media or anything, like you said, quiet, went about his business, but extremely nice guy. And really, like you mentioned, the versatility that he showed at Alabama and has since as a professional, I mean, just reflects not only like superior athleticism, but football IQ that's just off the charts. Just a really great player. And I think Mika is probably one of the most liked players in recent memory.
Oh yeah, I think so. I'm gonna throw another name out here now from earlier in at least my career covering the Saban era Alabama for AL.com rather. And it's a name that does not come without controversy. But I'm going to put him on this list anyway because he was a guy that we absolutely did not know what was going through his head from one week to the next a lot of times. And that is Reuben Foster. You know, Reuben, if we're talking about interesting here, I think you have to put Reuben on the list. And I mean, it's been going on for him since before he was at Alabama, since before he was committed to Alabama. This is a guy who I covered his recruitment, which was one of the wildest recruiting sagas that I have ever followed, that I can recall anybody following in college football. It's as a lot of people remember, probably the main thing that most people remember about him is he was at one point committed to Auburn and got an Auburn tattoo on his arm, and then ended up flipping and going to Alabama. And I mean, he was. I think he was genuinely divided on what to do about his future. Reuben also, not to get too far in this direction, but Reuben has a personal history that is extremely dramatic, that involves him really almost being killed as a baby, and they end up catching the guy who did it while he was in college. So an incredibly dramatic personal story for Reuben, who, we can only imagine that's one piece of what he grew up in. And I think that's enough for us to know that this is a guy who overcame a lot to become a college athlete, to get to Alabama and compete at the highest level and play on national championship teams. And then once he gets there, despite all of that, I mean, Reuben was a hugely well-liked player. He was one of the most lovable personalities on the team. He was always joking around. Every time we ever got a chance to see Reuben in one of those big media day type environments, he was the star of the show. He had an infectious personality that people just wanted to put their cameras on him. He was somebody who very clearly liked making other people happy and making other people laugh. And, he has continued to run into issues at the NFL level. I know that currently the sort of biggest, most controversial charges against him were dropped, but still a guy who has I think he's always managed to do things that make people around him impressed and drawn to him, and yet at the same time he can't seem to stay completely away from trouble and controversy. It's just sort of, they seem to go together with Reuben for some reason.
Yeah, while he was at Alabama, like you said, just always a delight to watch, whether that was on the field where he was just this like heat-seeking missile most of the time, where he's known for some of the hardest bone-crunching hits, I think, in recent history. But you're right, just kind of like a jovial presence, whether he's talking to the media or just wherever. You can see him just kind of bouncing around the sidelines sometimes, usually with a big smile on his face. So definitely a guy that sort of like lit up the field and lit up the room while he was there. I remember early when I was taking photos for us and I was covering, I can't even remember which game it was. One of my favorite pictures I got was of him and Lane Kiffin joking around while they were walking off of the field. And I just thought I couldn't have gotten two of the more like bigger personalities of this era just kind of having a laugh with each other as they were walking off the field after a victory. So Reuben Foster, a very interesting guy for sure, and an amazing football player. Things have obviously gone in a different direction than I'm sure he had hoped in the NFL, but I think he's still working at it, and we'll see where it goes from here.
Leonard Fournette certainly remembers Reuben Foster, so
absolutely,
he'll never be forgotten in that context. All right, who's next for you, Ben?
So next for me is J.K. Scott, and you rarely hear much from punters in the media, but J.K. Scott was always an interesting interview when he got the opportunity. And, it's no surprise that anyone playing at Alabama is a thoughtful person. But I think that we get caught off guard sometimes when we hadn't really heard much from them up to the point when we finally get the chance to have a word with them, right? And you had mentioned that there are some players who have been obviously maybe fed lines, media coach to a degree, and they give you answers that you're kind of expecting, kind of like stock answers, which is, it comes with the territory. But maybe you get somebody who's just not really interested in doing that and wants to speak their mind. And Matt, I'll give you credit again with getting a great quote out of a player.
I'm usually just there. I'm usually just that. The key is just being there when they talk. Basically,
a lot of people are there, Matt, and but you got these sound bites. But when you spoke to J.K. Scott about players' relationships with fans and how he didn't really hold back, at least in the sense of this truthful idea that the love that they show can be conditional, right? And that there are definitely fans who are ride or die. But if you aren't winning, then maybe you aren't getting as much love. And that's something that Najee Harris reiterated in the Road to the Pros doc, as we mentioned. But, JK was he was always an interesting guy. He was mild-mannered. He spoke quietly. He was also somebody who was very public with his faith, too. And you often hear players express themselves through their faith, and they thank God and discuss their faith during interviews, especially after winning big games or awards. But he really seemed to make a concerted effort to work it into just about everything that he said, no matter what, where you were seeing somebody exhibit this as like a true way of life, which I think is somewhat rare, Matt.
No, I think he is. Anybody on that beat is going to tell you, and particularly our colleague Michael Casagrande, who has sort of become fascinated with JK. He was truly a different dude, and like you said, lots of guys talk about their faith. I would say Tua Tagovailoa is a great example of it, who was never shy about talking about religion or the role that it played in his life. But J.K. Scott was different with it somehow. And I mean, it was truly, he found a way to incorporate it into everything that he did, including football. It was just sort of the basic truth of of the way he saw the world. And, I think not to put a quality statement on this for anybody. I think for some people, their faith takes a very different form. But for J.K. Scott, it was very obvious how real it was to him and how much of a part it was of everything he did, including punting. I think that he made that a part of his ritual. I think it was part of the way that he treated his teammates, certainly. And I think that is a big part of why he was so well liked on the team and on the beat as well. He just was very patient and compassionate with everybody that he dealt with. And like you said, I mean, that it's not so much the content of what he was saying to me about fans, but it was the tone too. I mean, I think it would be very easy, I would imagine, if I was a college football player, I think it would be very easy to get frustrated with fans because as all of us know who are watching, there are always fans that embarrass us to be there in the stands with us, right? There are always guys we look at and say, man, I hate that guy reflects on me as a fan. And it doesn't mean that all fans are bad, but there's always going to be bad fans. And I think that would frustrate any player. But JK, it was almost like, look, I'm not knocking fans, but they are what they are. They're there to have a good time for themselves, and that's fine. That's what they should do. But that's not where I get my validation from. And I think his faith really informed that. I think there are guys who come to the same conclusion, but for JK, the way he got there was, I've got validation elsewhere. I draw my purpose from life from other things besides people cheering for me.
Yeah, also a much taller guy than you would think he would be.
He's very tall, yeah.
Very, very tall. And, he's a guy who's obviously he's an athlete. He's a professional athlete. He obviously takes care of himself. But, like, for a split second, Matt, if you didn't know he was a punter, you might think, is this guy, is he a wide receiver? I don't know, but no, not really. He's a punter. But, Matt, is he is he Alabama's best punter ever?
Oh, I don't think there's any question. I mean, I would say he's honestly one of the best punters in modern college football history. I had joked with you over the years, Ben, that Nick Saban had an elite player at every single position except punter and kicker. And you can check punter off the list at this point. We'll see about kicker. I mean, look, Will Reichard was perfect last year. Hard to do much better than that, although he didn't have a ton asked of him. So he's got a career ahead of him. We'll see. He's got a chance to finish as a guy that we talk about as one of the most interesting Alabama players. We don't know a lot about him yet, but I think it makes you automatically interesting if you don't miss a kick and play for Alabama. That definitely makes you unique.
Yeah, with respect to Lane Bearden, a hero to many, I think J.K. Scott probably has that title. And I remember, maybe it was when he was a freshman and he hadn't quite played yet, he hadn't seen game action yet. I remember somebody asked Saban about him, and Saban's only response was, "Have you seen him kick?" And so there was a lot of hype around him going into his career, and he delivered on it. I mean, the ball just boomed off of his foot.
Yeah, for sure, a memorable player in this era of guys that we sometimes forget just because of how many there are. But if you can be a great special teams player at Alabama, people remember you. Our friend Javar Santana here wants to know about John Parker Wilson, and I will say I can offer up some insight here because we've gotten to work with John Parker a lot over the years at AL.com. He is now the radio color analyst for Alabama, but before he did that, he was a regular part of all of our broadcasts here at AL.com. We did several series with him, and I will say this. John Parker is I think recognizes that he is a regular dude now, and I don't mean that as a knock to JPW at all. I think it's one of the most likable things about him. But he was at Alabama for the transition. He was recruited by Mike Shula and ended up being there and winning the job when Nick Saban arrived. And I think he is a guy who had a lot of talent and ability as a high school player. But I think he looks around now and knows, look, I wouldn't have gotten a chance to be a part of this team had they been sort of rolling and in their top form when I first got there. And so I think he feels really fortunate, and I think he sort of really enjoys the fact that he got to play with guys like Julio Jones and Mark Barron, and he got to be there for the beginning of things turning around for Alabama. And that we've talked to him a lot about that 2008 season when everything sort of took off for Alabama. And it is without question something that brings him a lot of joy to talk about and a lot of pride. But that said, he's definitely I can say he's a guy that you would eat barbecue and drink beer with, because I have done that with John Parker. He is not necessarily somebody you'd see in a bar and go like, that guy played in the NFL. But he's still got there is a thing that they don't tell you about with quarterbacks. And if you've played football, you probably already know this. But quarterbacks have some kind of automatic charisma. Man, maybe that's what makes you a quarterback. But they have this quality where when they walk into a room full of people, everybody pays attention to them. And that's John Parker's got that. Every time he would walk into the office to film with us, he's doing finger guns at people. People are gravitating to him. He has that sort of charisma of a quarterback.
I have one quick John Parker Wilson story, which he won't remember, but I came into our office at AL.com to interview him about something. I think it was playing during the Shula era. And I always wanted to ask him about a football game that he played in high school. He used to play for Hoover High School famously, right. Obviously. In my alma mater, Central High School, played Hoover during, I think, the first or second round of the playoffs. We played them at the Hoover Met, and Central scored on the first play from scrimmage and went up on Hoover, who is this juggernaut. And then Hoover, led by John Parker, went on with Chad Jackson to just blow out Central after that. It was not even a game. And I asked him, do you remember that? And he goes, no, I don't really remember that very well. But I'll tell you what I do remember about Central. I remember cracking the longest home run I've ever hit in my entire high school career in a baseball game once. And he did the swinging motion and everything. And I was just like, well, I didn't really ask you about that, John Parker, but I appreciate you. I appreciate you adding to the list of just horrible, Central athletic memories for me.
Unfortunately, Hoover has humiliated many of our alma maters here in the state of Alabama at a variety of sports.
And he was responsible for a lot of that.
Yeah. I will highlight a comment here from William Chun, who's getting to meet Sherman Williams tomorrow. So have fun with that, William. That's pretty cool. I'm glad to see older players from the 92 team are still out there doing meet and greets and wherever that event is, but that should be fun. Ben, Do we have another name we want to get to?
Yeah, I've just got two more, Matt. And,
Yeah, let's
and
do
one
it.
so one is Tony Brown, the just absolutely at times mystifying, but very entertaining defensive back from the Saban era. And I'm not sure where to really start with Tony Brown. He's become sort of like this figure in like Twitter lore, where people are still resharing videos from his time at Alabama. And there was certainly a lot of excitement and excitement around his recruitment and commitment at Alabama. He was another 5-star defensive back in the mix, said to be this guy with just like super speed, but we could not anticipate his personality, Matt. And it's hard to like narrow it down, like what made him so fun and funny and different. But he was a guy who just did these things where it just kept building on top of, again, this mystique, including everybody remembers the end of the Clemson game in 2017, I think it was, that semifinal rematch the year after Clemson had beaten Alabama, where Tony Brown was on the unfortunate receiving end of Clemson's game-winning touchdown.
Ben, it's the same trip to New Orleans that yielded the Ryan Anderson quote we're talking about earlier.
Yeah, and after that game, he, again, not to throw too many like pro wrestling references into this, but he cut one of the all-time promos at the end of the game when a reporter came up to him and just asked him, what do you think? Like, what a win! How do you feel? And he was just on a different level of intensity, still game mode intensity, where he just went off on Clemson's wide receiver Hunter Renfrow, who caught that game-winning pass, and he was feeling himself. He felt good about it. I can't quote it exactly, but Tony Brown, you just got to look it up on YouTube or Twitter, Tony Brown after the Clemson game. And the reporter's expression after the interview was over, I think, tells the whole story. But you have these other moments where I think it was before an LSU game one year when LSU was warming up before the game, and Tony Brown, shirtless, as was often the case with Tony Brown, just slowly walked through the entire field, LSU side of the field during their warm-ups. I'm not sure what kind of message he was trying to send to them or what his game day routine was there pregame or before kickoff, but I think the message was received that Tony Brown was ready for that game. But you also have like the White House visit. Tony Brown's fashion was always something to keep an eye on. But I remember too, Matt, there's this event every year. They obviously didn't do it last year because of COVID that Alabama does. It's called the Halloween Extravaganza, where Alabama athletes hand out candy to kids who are dressed in costumes. The athletes will dress in costumes too, and often football players will be involved at the event. And Tony Brown was at one of the events, and I thought he really stuck out to me because I was photographing it, and he stuck out to me as one of the guys who was really good with kids. Like, he was ready to take photos. He was holding babies, laughing with them, joking with them. So Tony Brown is a guy, I think, whose personality is very infectious, and is somebody who has brought a lot of joy and laughs to the program. But he was also a really accomplished athlete too. The guy was a freak of nature when it came to speed, and he made plays in games. Had an interception in that Georgia National Championship game. So he did it on the field too. But Tony Brown, again, he's just this guy that I think a lot of people are going to remember.
For sure. And that great moment after the Clemson game, by the way, was the reporter on the receiving end of that one was our friend Simone Eli, who hosts our recruiting show every Wednesday on this channel. Although actually, I think they're doing it tomorrow this week. So check that out if you have not already watched our recruiting show from Simone. And they're pretty frequently talking about big name guys coming to Alabama in the near future. Maybe we can get Simone on here one day to talk about that moment with Tony and do a little recap, a little flashback to that
viral moment. It was amazing.
Yeah, very, very good stuff. I'm gonna throw another one out here real quick, Ben, before we wrap up. This will be my last one that I mentioned. But Damian Harris, for me, was a guy that I feel like doesn't get talked about a ton anymore, even though he's I would say at this point really establishing himself as a presence in the NFL. But I think had a very important role to play at Alabama on the field, and was a just sort of very workmanlike, very consistent running back for Alabama in his time there. But off the field was one of the most, I think, fascinating guys that we got to talk to, and was an example, I think, of, in some ways, making people like Najee Harris feel safer speaking their mind and saying things that maybe aren't totally run of the mill and safe and canned answers like we often get from college athletes. Damian Harris was a little bit more willing to say things that might not be something everybody agrees with. That he felt like he could speak his mind and say what he thought about things. And I think Damian Harris was respected in the locker room because of that. I can remember after the national championship loss, Damian Harris was a guy who was really obviously very upset and took it hard, but also had kind of I think a presence about him that held that team together, that kept those guys from turning on each other like sometimes teams can in the aftermath of a tough loss. Damian Harris, I think, was a leader for that team. And often a leader, I think, can be even more needed to step up when things are not going well than when everything is going great. So I think he's a guy who, again, I think people like him. I think people remember that he was a good player, but I don't know that Damian Harris gets enough credit for the leadership role that he played on some teams that, frankly, hardly ever lost while he was there.
Yeah, Damien Harris was great. He's a guy who, just an amazing interview whenever he was in front of a camera or talking to a reporter. I think that he has even publicly expressed, or at one time did express intent or desire to pursue a future in broadcasting. And that's, I think, he'd be great at it. Yeah. Oh, it's no surprise at all if that's the case. But I mean, he's obviously shown flashes of enormous potential in the NFL now, playing for the New England Patriots. So it may be a while before he gets there, as long as he continues to have success on that level. But yeah, you're right. Lot of fun to watch as a player too. I mean, this is a guy who started some really talented backfields, right? Where you had guys like Josh Jacobs and Najee Harris, and Damian Harris for, I think, 3 straight years was the starting running back during his career. So that's a pretty impressive feat unto itself, and just the model of consistency. Always put up numbers and was just an excellent back. But you're right, just a tremendous interview. A guy, again, who was not afraid to share his perspective on important matters as well as the game.
We've got a commenter, Dennis Smith Jr., who says, y'all gonna suck next year. But y'all let Dennis know what you think. Do you agree with Dennis's opinion about the 2021 Alabama team?
It's not the NBA player, Dennis Smith Jr. That certainly appears to be his avatar. Is he watching this show right now?
Maybe this is some NBA stolen valor here. But I don't.
Hey, man, I love you on the Mavericks, Dennis.
Dennis, I'm not good at predicting the future. I'm not good at predicting winners for football games. But I would say it's generally a bad bet to guess that Alabama is going to suck in the near future. So would not put money on that. All right, Ben, let's do one more name. I think you've got one more guy on your list.
Yeah, one more. I had a long list, and I can go over a few honorable mentions soon. It's just guys who I just always thought brought a lot to the table from a personality standpoint. But the last guy that I want to mention here is Alfons Taylor, the former Alabama offensive lineman, better known to many as Shank. Interesting nickname that stuck, and you can follow him on Twitter at ShankK50, and I recommend it. Especially, he's not as active as he used to be in terms of his commentary on Alabama football, but a couple of years ago, this guy was a must-follow when it came to understanding the game in a different way, and somebody who was bringing a very new and interesting perspective as a guy who played, right? As a guy who actually played during the Saban era and in some of the biggest games. He had a lot of intensity too as a player. Like after big runs, he would be one of the only guys on the field or on the offensive line who would be like really pumped up, pumping his fist, excited about what just happened, even if it was just like a short gain or something. This guy really cared about what he did on the offensive line and worked harder than anybody, it seemed, playing in the trenches there. But he kind of reminds me of like Cole Kubelik, who's another friend to AL.com and that you've worked with in the past, somebody who really made an effort to let you in on just what the process was like for an offensive lineman and in those trenches, and gave you an inside look that you hadn't quite seen prior to that. And just a really entertaining guy. Always had something interesting to say about Alabama or college football or the game that he might be live tweeting. So really funny personality who came out of the Saban era, a great Twitter follow, somebody to keep an eye on, especially as the season is going on.
For sure. Yeah, I would say that's been a big lasting legacy for him, is, and some players beyond him as well. If you played for Saban, if you played in this system, you've been through something that not a lot of people who are out there talking and commentating right now have experienced. And so your voice is really valuable. And honestly, the main reason is because most of those guys are still playing professional football, and that's why they can't talk about it yet. But, I mean, you look at, again, John Parker Wilson's done it for us. Greg McElroy is doing it on a very high level for ESPN. If you are a guy who has been a part of this dynasty, you have some insight that the rest of us can't really understand. And I always find it really interesting to hear what those guys have to say, exactly because of that. They all have a level of insight that the rest of us only really think we know what's going on, and how Saban might be reacting and how it feels for the team to be going through that. But Alfons Taylor knows. I mean, he knows what it takes for these guys to be as good as they are. He knows what they've been through, and he knows that sometimes you can only go through so much of that before it starts to have a negative impact. So I've always found guys like Alfons's perspectives to be extremely important and insightful for me as a writer to try and figure out what's going on with this team. Where are they? How are they going to respond to what's going on to them right now? And so, yeah, I mean, I think, and I love how honest he is about it. I love that he also is a fan. I love that he, as we would say, Ben, he gumps really hard on Twitter. I mean, he is rooting for Alabama to do well, but he also can explain to you when something goes wrong and maybe what happened behind that. Yeah,
very, very, very entertaining guy and insightful. And I'd love to see more of that in the future. And social media is just it provides a lot of great opportunities, not only for guys like Alfons to express themselves and sort of get in on the commentary action, but for fans to learn something about the game. Like you said, we only know so much if we've never played football. We know what we see on TV. We know what the commentators like Kirk Herbstreit and otherwise tell us. But when you have other players like this, especially those who have played so recently during this Saban era that has given fans so much, then you'll learn that much more and you'll be that much more clued in on the game as you watch it, and it'll change the way you see it.
Very true. Well, do you want to give us some honorable mentions?
Yeah, just a few honorable mentions. Yeah, quickly. All the guys that I mentioned, but others I could have just as easily talked about. Barrett Jones, I think, was always an interesting guy. I think he's in broadcasting now, maybe for ESPN Radio, or he was recently. Really interesting, insightful personality. Julio Jones, obviously a huge player. Everybody knows who he is. But during college, especially before he got here and even while he was at Alabama, he was very mysterious character, right? Like he didn't have much to say. He let his play do his talking. Yeah, still is to a degree. Let his play do his talking. So, yeah, legend at Alabama. Jonathan Allen, I thought was great. A fantastic interview. Has one of the great sound bites in the history of sports where he said Alabama does after somebody says, who blows out a team in the college football semifinal? Fantastic. Landon Dickerson, obviously an animated, bright and funny guy who just left the program. Quinnen Williams, who became, one meme after another after he left Alabama and went to the Jets and is enjoying a lot of success. And another guy I think is very interesting for a lot of different reasons, Rolando Mclean, the just absolutely accomplished linebacker under Nick Saban, who, a lot of stories that folks can tell about Rolando Mclean, but he was never a dull moment with him. That's for sure.
Yep, absolutely. I'll throw a quick honorable mention out there for Rashaan Evans as well, who we previously did a Road to the Pro series about, but just a guy from a very unusual background, not at all the person that you I think would assume he is from seeing him out there in the NFL today or following him on social media. He's come from a mysterious background himself. His dad played for Auburn. He grew up on a farm in East Alabama. He chased horses to try and make himself faster. And now he's out there today in Nashville playing for the Titans, living it up like a big NFL star. So another very interesting dude.
Yeah.
But thanks to everybody for joining us as always. Thanks to Kenneth Sawyer. Thanks to Isan Ball. Thanks to everybody who commented today and was participating in the discussion. And we really appreciate you guys always getting involved in the discussion as we do our Bammers show like we do every Thursday morning. And we'll be back again next week, really to get you guys ready for the NFL draft, which is next Thursday night. So we'll be doing an NFL themed show next week here on Bammers. And then we'll get to spend that night watching probably a high number of Bama players become NFL players. So it'll be a fun one. Ben, thanks as always for joining me.
Thanks, Matt.